Hello, hello. My name is Sophia Prater, and I'm a UX designer and UX coach. And I train UX teams at companies like Adobe and HubSpot and Facebook and MasterCard, just to name a few. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how to reduce rework with the magic of object-oriented UX. We're going to go over how to identify objects, relationships, and attributes so that we can get to the heart of the core value of what we're actually designing, improve the UX, and make sure we're just super clear on what our screens are representing before we jump into design. So with this process, which puts a brief pause on the rush to screen design, you'll reduce guesswork, accelerate your work, and create better outcomes for the business and for the users. So first, let me paint a picture for you. Have you ever been weeks or months into a project, deep in high fidelity, and something comes up? And you end up saying to yourself, dang it, I wish I had asked this question earlier. Or worse, why didn't my client tell me this? Why didn't so-and-so tell me this? So what do we do to prevent this? To just do our best to prevent this? We sketch first, right? But the problem is we sketch screens and interface and layout while using sketching to define content, information architecture, and business requirements. And what happens there is we end up multitasking, right? And we all know multitasking is basically doing two things worse. So what we really need to be doing is sketching structure, the system, and the business rules first, and validating that, and then getting into screen design. So while we're in developer mode, while we're actually building, we know to separate content from display, right? One reason we love building in Webflow and Adalo and integrating with Airtable is because this lets us separate our content and our data from the display. But when we're designing, we still tend to merge the two together. So would you use HTML for visual design? Right? We don't do that anymore. So in the same way we don't want to use HTML for visual design anymore, we don't want to use visual design for content structure and business requirements. But everyone's in a hurry to see screens, right? So, okay, sure, you can build those screens, show your clients, show your stakeholders those screens, and then realize that those screens don't quite meet requirements. And then you can iterate, AKA redo a bunch of work. Or what I'm suggesting is you can bring your client into the complexity, get answers early on, and get it way more right the first time. And the key to that, to get those early on answers, is to ask really good questions early on. And that's really what I'm about to teach you today. So enter OOUX. So OOUX helps you strategically separate content and display during the design process, giving you a tool to untangle complexity when you're still in low fidelity. So before we get into screen design, what we want to do is we can actually abstract the structure that's going to make up those screens and validate that first. And we're going to do that by answering 4 critical questions before we get into screen design. So those questions, we the OOUXers, which I hope you all become, answer these questions before designing a single screen, before even sketching a single screen. First, what are the objects in the user's mental model / business model? What are the objects' relationships to each other? What calls to action do objects offer users? So what can users do to those objects? And what are the attributes that make up the objects? What is sort of the chemical makeup of all of these objects? And this aligns to my very favorite acronym in the whole wide world, ORCA. So today, we're actually going to be focusing on the O and the R and the A of ORCA, objects, relationships, and attributes. We're not going to be getting into calls to action too much. So we're just going to really focusing on, I guess, the aura process right now. Okay. So in Webflow, just to kind of align what you might already know to pieces you already know, when we're talking about the objects, we're talking about our CMS collection. So when I say objects, if you're deep in Webflow, you can think of your collections. When I'm talking about relationships, I'm talking about these little guys, right? Our referenced collections and our multi-reference collections, how we're connecting those collections or objects. And then when I'm talking about attributes, I'm talking about all those other elements that we use to basically make up the forms and the fields that our content creators are going to use to enter in instances or items in our collection. If you're an Airtable user, we've also got objects, relationships, and attributes. So our objects are going to be our tabs across the top, basically the tables. Our relationships are going to be when we're linking to other records, right? That fun thing in Airtable that we all love. And our attributes are going to be the column headers, all right, where we're deciding that a partnership application needs a sponsorship level, and that's going to be a drop down, and we're going to have controlled values there. And we need a proposed monetary donation that's going to be in currency. Those are going to be our attributes. Okay, before we move too much forward, I'm going to be using an example here. This is a pro bono project that we're working on at Rewired for the Georgia Mountain Trails Partnership. And this is simply to show you the kind of things to watch out for and the kind of questions we want to be asking. Don't get too much in the weeds by the intricacies of the example, okay? GMTP, Georgia Mountain Trails Partnership, kind of a wordy name. So I might say GMTP is for illustration only. Okay, so let's start with objects. Let's talk about the why do we want to identify them? How do we actually go about it? And what are some additional complexity exposing questions that we can ask about objects to really, again, get to the heart of the value? Okay, so let's start with the why. Why do we want to define objects? So here is the hard truth. Your users and even your stakeholders, they don't care about layouts and buttons and drop downs and components. That is all packaging. It's very, very important. But what we need to do first is we need to figure out what really matters to the users. What are they actually coming for? Do our customers or users, do they want salt? Do they want mustard? Do they want napkins? Let's define that before we figure out how to package it beautifully and ergonomically and on brand. Our screens and our components are simply a means to an end. So what we want to do is we want to start out with those real valuable things that our business is wanting to share or sell and that the users are actually coming for. So we need to identify those things. So how do we identify those things? All right, so we do this. The very first step of the process is noun foraging. And this is actually really, really fun, kind of a fun game. So what I want you to do is I want you to listen for the nouns that you hear over and over and over again. So while you're in meetings with stakeholders, if you get to do user interviews, listen for the nouns. Competitive analysis, look at labels, page names, the existing system as well. All right, you can be really resourceful looking for as many, going to as many places as possible to do your noun foraging. Some of those nouns, especially the nouns that you start hearing over and over and over again, those are going to be the objects in your system. And figuring out those objects is a great way to start your design process. So this is actually how I synthesize research. No matter how paltry or robust my research actually is, I start by taking all those inputs and doing this noun foraging, and of course, looking for synonyms as well, and sort of kind of overlaying them. So you do some sort of affinity mapping with your objects. So for the Georgia Mountain Trails Partnership, I mentioned this was a pro bono project. Research included a competitive analysis. We looked at other similar websites. We looked at their existing websites actually that were going to get combined into one. And we had quite a few stakeholder meetings. And that's what we actually used to do our noun foraging. And it looked something like this. So in the pink, you can see some statements that I was hearing during those stakeholder meetings. And while listening, I'm writing down nouns. That's what you're going to see in the blue. And then instances of those nouns, I'm writing those as well. Those are what's in the yellow. And you can think of the nouns and those instances of nouns sort of as the overarching concepts in the blue, and the proper nouns or kind of examples, those are going to be in the yellow. And as I'm doing this, I'm asking lots of follow-up questions. So through these series of conversations, we're going to start narrowing down to the objects that are going to be most important to feature on GMTP's website, because we're probably not going to feature all of these things. Land trust was one that I was very curious about. So we continue to listen to statements like the ones you see in pink here, and we continue to ask more and more follow-up questions to hone in on what this website really needs to consist of. So we narrowed down to our main objects. This is actually what we ended up with. Here we have it in blue, our 5 main objects that will make up Georgia Mountain Trails partnership website, at least the first iteration of it, the phase 1. So that's a project, a partner, just kind of like a sponsor, partnerships, which is a tricky one, events, and profiles. Okay, so you can see here, it's also, I have my objects in blue, but then I also have those examples or instances in yellow, the actual items. So these would actually be the items in your collection if we're thinking in Webflow terms. And doing this makes sure we're all thinking about the same thing. For example, here is Trails Fest 2022. Is that really considered a project? It seems maybe it's too big to be a project. So we want to have that conversation. Is that really a project? Is Orange Walls the band a profile or a partner? Where does that fit in? So we're just really making sure that we're all singing from the same sheet of music, that we all have a really good idea of what these things are, and having good examples in our head helps a lot. And making sure that we all have the same thought bubble. Okay, so as you noun forage, here are some questions to help you validate those nouns. All right, so for example, with GMTP, we asked, are vendors and sponsors different? And can a sponsor also be a vendor? And how are projects and events different? And can you define a partnership with me? Everybody write down a definition of a partnership, and then let's compare them. That's a really fun exercise to do with your clients and stakeholders. So what would you call a silent auction? Is that an event or is that something else? Okay, so in summary, I want you to ask these types of questions early on. Ask them now, and this is going to set yourself up to deliver a solution that fits really nicely. So you may have seen that graph, how the cost of change increases with time, all right? So what you want to avoid is realizing you have a square peg that doesn't fit in the round hole late in the game, because it's going to be much more expensive to change when you're in high fidelity or when you're deeper in development. You can do this when you're in sticky notes. All right, let's talk about the R of the OOUX process, relationships. Why do we need to identify them? How do we do that? And what kind of additional future-proofing questions can we ask? So let's start with the why. Why define relationships? First, this is kind of a funky one, context. So defining relationships is going to help further define our objects in that particular context. It's going to help us understand those objects. So is it peanut butter and jelly, or is it peanut butter in a Kong dog toy? Okay, the relationship between peanut butter and the other object really does define what peanut butter means in this scenario, in this given context. I might, and what we did do with Georgia Mountain Trails partnership, is finding out that events are part of a project and will always be part of a project. Another reason is navigation. So what we want to do is we want to improve our navigation by baking in what I like to call contextual navigation or cross-linking. So let's say, like what we were just talking about, we have projects, and a project has many events that sort of make up the project. So we want a user to be able to navigate from a project detail to the event detail and vice versa, right? So if I'm on an event, I need to navigate back to the project that it's part of, okay, without having to kind of click through links at the top. We still want to have our main navigation, but having that in-context navigation is great for user experience. It's also really great for SEO too. All right, third, we want to actually use our relationships to help plan a really elegant authoring experience. So we don't want to build connections in a way that are going to feel awkward to our content creators. So I don't want a creator to have to create an event and then have to click out and navigate over to the project to then add the event, right? And if a partner shows up across many projects, I don't want my author to have to upload that partner logo more than one time, okay? So Good relationship design actually leads to a smart, elegant authoring experience. Okay, so how do we do that? We're going to play relationship battleship with a nested object matrix. All right, you can also do this with entity relationship diagramming or some sort of like system modeling. This is my particular method to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. Okay, so what you're looking at here, this is one of my favorite complexity wrangling tools. I give it to you. I hope you enjoy it. It is a wonderful, beautiful thing. It is the nested object matrix. And so what you're looking at here is you have our objects across the x-axis, project, partner, partnership, event, and profile. And then you have the exact same objects down the y-axis. And what we're doing here is now in the intersections, we can explore every potential relationship. And some of those intersections, there's not going to be a relationship there, but I at least spent a good, maybe sometimes just 30 seconds or a minute and 30 seconds to realize, okay, there's no relationship here. Some of those, like what you see in gray, are actually relationships by proxy. So there is a relationship, but it's actually connected through another object. It's a tricky one. But what you see in blue here is all the relationships that I did identify. Okay, and you can actually start planning out your CMS here just a little bit. You see those little link icons that I've got in there in the upper left-hand corner on some of those sticky notes. So that's me going ahead and planning out how I'm going to build my reference collection in Webflow. Okay, it's the age-old question of which way do you build it, right? We've all done that before where we build it the wrong way and we realize it actually would have been better to build it the other way, or we end up building it both ways and we create a redundancy in there. So we can start planning out how we're actually going to construct our referenced collections through this nested object matrix. So for example, here if I'm going to create a new profile, I can link to I'm going to actually link to the partner when I'm creating a new profile. I'm not going to link my profiles underneath the partner when I'm creating a partner. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. If you spend a lot of time in reference collections, I hope you know what I'm talking about here. Okay, so questions to ask as you're going through this process. What is the relationship between X and Y? You can even do this as a binary with your clients first. Is there a relationship between X and Y? Sometimes you need to start there. Okay, yes. Tell me more about that relationship. Then you can get into some more detail, like can X have many of Y or is it just one? So you're starting to drill down into, is this a single reference or is this going to be a multi-reference? And would X sometimes have 0 Y if there is a relationship? This is going to help you figure out, do you need a required field or do you need, does it need to be required? Or if it can be 0, do you need some conditional logic to hide the event section on some projects, which we actually do need for Georgia Mountain Trails Partnership? Some projects don't have any events. So we want to be able to programmatically hide that event section. And I'm getting to that by asking the question, would we ever have a project without any events? The answer was yes. Okay, so in summary, we want to ask the questions now because we want to create an elegant system of interconnected, valuable content. We don't want to untangle our CMS referenced collections late in the game, right? That can be really, really difficult. And we want to make sure our authoring experience doesn't have your content creators confused or duplicating their effort. Okay, so we're skipping the C of the OOUX process. Let's move on to the A, attributes. All right, why do we need to identify attributes? How do we do it? And what are some additional thank yourself later questions to ask? Okay, why? Why do we need to figure out our attributes? So we want to figure out what goes on the page before designing the page. This is just like figuring out what are the ingredients in the dish before we start making the dish, okay? Making sure we've got all the ingredients right. Also, the cool thing about creating an inventory of attributes, an inventory of ingredients for our object, is that then we can prioritize those attributes. All right, we can prioritize them with the client, hopefully even with our users. And that's going to help us make sure that high priority attributes are shown in the list view of the thing. And the lower priority attributes can be revealed one click away on the detail page. So this is just basic progressive disclosure. To do progressive disclosure correctly, we need to actually have our attributes prioritized so we know what can be shifted to a detail page and what needs to be on our list in those little cards on the list. All right. Finally, our attributes help us see what kind of sorting and filtering abilities we might need to have. So if I want to group events by live music and lectures, I'm going to need to create metadata so that I can do that. So I'm already preempting how am I going to need to section off or group or show subsets or sort, showing the, changing the order of all of my items in a collection. I can start planning that early on, which is very, very helpful. Okay, how do we do that? All right, we're getting to the holy grail of OOUX. So what we want to do is we want to collaborate on an object map. An object map is a bird's eye X-ray view of the entire system, shared and understood by all parties, which is a beautiful thing. So the nested object matrix was the foundation of our object map. We're just going to build on that. And we're going to add some pink and yellow sticky notes to make it a bit more colorful and also a whole lot more powerful too. Okay, so what we're looking at here is core content versus metadata. So we're going to put, we have lots of fun color coding in object-oriented UX. We're going to put our core content on yellow sticky notes and our metadata on pink sticky notes. So core content are those attributes where for every instance, you're probably going to have a unique value. Okay, so things like pictures and titles and descriptions, and our metadata are going to be our attributes that have more structured values and are going to be the real powerhouse for sorting and filtering. So you can see here how this kind of aligns in the Webflow CMS. And the real important reason to separate these is so that if I'm looking at an object map, I can start identifying what are going to be my main drivers for sorting and filtering. It's going to be the pink metadata. And then what about those reference collections? What are those? That's going to be our nested objects, right? Okay, which we've already figured that out. All right, so when you're doing your object mapping, in person is great with sticky notes. If you can do it safely, this is a really wonderful tactile collaborative activity that you can do with your clients, with your stakeholders, even with your users. I've multiple times brought users, taught them how to do this, and kind of got them to design the structure for me, which is amazing. If you can't do this in person, Mural and Miro, they've got your back. FigJam, whatever you use. Basically, you need sticky notes that can be moved around collaboratively. And all we're doing here is we still have our objects across the top, and we've got instances next. But we're just basically building on what we've already done. We've taken our nested object matrix, kind of cleaned it up, scooted everything up, and we're continuing our columns down where we're listing our core content and our metadata under each column for each object. So for a project, I can start seeing the structure of it. I can see a project has a logo, it's got a banner image, it's got a start date and an end date. A partnership, a partnership has got a sponsor level, all right? So I'm already mapping all of that out. So each of these columns is basically going to be a direct translation into not only designing my CMS, but also designing those detail pages and also those list pages. Okay, so we're not yet to the CMS. So I highly recommend, especially if you have a more complex system, to move your object map from something like a sticky noting medium into a more robust tool. I personally like Trello a lot. I've been using Trello for a while. You can use Notion as well. Airtable actually works for this too. But we move it over into a more robust tool so that we can pretty much give our attributes additional metadata. So I can go in and I can comment on individual attributes, ask additional questions, do things like create custom fields. I love custom fields in Trello where I can have an admin only checkbox or an open question checkbox or a required field. I can start checking off what fields are required before actually I get into Webflow or whatever tool I happen to be using. So for example, with GMTP, we were asking a whole lot of follow-up questions to really suss out all this complexity. So what do we want to show about a profile? Do we want to show profile pictures? For a partner, okay, we have vendors and sponsors as the different types of partner. What about those nonprofit sister organizations? Are those considered partners too? How do we handle those? Do we need to display events by music versus trail talks? Do we really actually want to separate those out? Oh, then we find out that sponsorship levels have different levels per project. That was a fun one to figure out. And definitely some complexity to untangle. That was so good that we did that before we actually started designing screens. We did that all in sticky notes. So ask the questions now. And then once you get all these nice answers and the dust settles on this object map, you can design your screens with a whole lot of confidence and a whole lot less rework, a whole lot less back and forth. So you may have pushed your sketching while doing this work, maybe for a few days, maybe for a week, but now the rest of your work is going to go so much smoother. And the CMS can actually be built in, I don't know, an hour or two. Okay, so here's the process that I propose. Get your research, however big or small it happens to be, however robust or meager your research is, pull it all together. Go through this process. Go through the OOUX process. Figure out your objects, your relationships. Calls to action are pretty self-explanatory. We've got a little call to action matrix too. But what do users want to do to those objects? And figure out your attributes in an object map. From there, you can go into a CMS build. Once the dust settles on it, build out your CMS or your database. So it might not be a CMS, maybe it's a database, an Airtable or Glide or something, or in a Dalo. Build that out. And then you can actually get content creation starting. You can actually start experimenting with content creation. Get your editors in, get them kicking the tires on this while you're doing screen sketching. Okay, and there might be some back and forth there, okay? You're not gonna get it 100% right the first time, okay? So before, without the OOUX process, you might have did a lot of back and forth. You're gonna probably get it 80 to 95% right, but sometimes you are gonna need them to actually start putting in real content to realize another field needs to be added, something needs to be tweaked, but those are gonna be usually small, detailed tweaks versus like big gotchas late in the game. And then from here, going into visual design and templates and screen design and applying your design system to actually create screens. Okay, so if you're anticipating pushback with this, maybe you think this sounds great, but I've got stakeholders that are always wanting to see screens yesterday. Feel free to take a screenshot of this. I'm sure you're going to get these slides as well. So I'm not going to read these out, but here's just some language that has worked for me, and feel free to take this verbatim or adjust it so that it works for you. Okay, so in conclusion, before you figure out your screens, figure out what objects and relationships and attributes those screens should represent. All right, so welcome to Object-Oriented UX. This is a world of less headache, less rework, more meaningful collaboration, less of those back and forth reviews, and better UX for our users and our authors. And it's a whole lot of fun too. So you can learn more on OOUX.com, and thank you very much.